Everyone will probably say this, but it is so true. Do not cram the night before the exam. The most important thing the night before the exam is to get a good night's sleep. You might be so nervous. You're like, I can get any new information that matters right before the exam, but you can't. Any information that you know you will have gotten in those time that you spent studying already. Really, you have to trust yourself.
You're listening to the ONS Podcast, where ONS Voices Talk Cancer, a resource from the Oncology Nursing Society. Through conversations with subject matter experts, we examine the important issues in oncology nursing, from new treatments to patient-centered research to advancements in clinical practice. Join us as we hear from nurses in all facets of oncology care, from bench to bedside and everywhere in between. Hello and welcome to the ONS Podcast. I'm your host, Jaime Weimer, Manager of Oncology Nursing Practice at ONS. And today we're talking with Talia Lapidus, Professional Staff Nurse in the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit at UPMC in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, about how to prepare for a nursing exam. Talia recently sat for and passed the NCLEX exam, and she'll be sharing what she learned through that experience. As a reminder, you can earn free NCPD contact hours after listening to this episode and completing the evaluation we've linked in the episode notes. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today, Talia, and congratulations on passing the NCLEX.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for having me.
We know that tests are not new for nurses. We take more tests than we probably like throughout all of our nursing studies. But the big one at the end, the NCLEX, definitely brings a different level of stress and importance to it. So talk to me a little bit about what you found to be the most important studying tips that you use that you would give to nurses who are studying for their NCLEX. And how did that help you?
The biggest studying tip that I found when I was studying was just consistency. I was studying every day and I was setting time aside every single day to study. It's really just about making sure that it's part of your daily routine. At first, it feels weird, like going from school to just straight up studying, but that's really what school was for, finding a study method that works for you that you can then implement into studying for the biggest test that you have to take.
Absolutely. And I'll mention, obviously, we're going to talk about the NCLEX today, but I think a lot of what you'll suggest and what worked will likely apply for those that are also preparing to sit for a certification exam. Again, a large exam, lots of sort of writing on the results of that. And so just something for our listeners to keep in mind of like, how could this apply to you if you are already a nurse and you hopefully never have to take the NCLEX again? How could these tips that you'll share today apply if you're sitting for that certification exam? So let's talk a little bit about resources. For you, what resources did you use that you would recommend? And are there any, that you found were free versus that cost money?
The way that this is kind of a side topic, but I found my resources by asking the nurses who I was working with in clinical what they used to pass the NCLEX. And I feel like it was just, instead of, going to Google, who they probably have ads there, going to the nurses who did pass this test was the best way for me to find valid resources. But what a lot of the nurses told me was UWorld, which does cost money, but it's a website that has practice questions and practice tests, and then explanations for all like the topics that are on the NCLEX. And it was completely worth it. All the questions were formulated like how they are on the NCLEX, which is so valuable in making your mind understand what the actual test will be like. Free resources, YouTube. If I didn't understand a topic, I would go to YouTube, search the topic, and there are millions of videos on there explaining every single topic that you could possibly think of.
You mentioned the question format, and I think that's so important, both for NCLEX and again for certification, of being able to understand what the question is actually asking and answering that correctly, because obviously there are distractors in there. They sometimes will give you more information than what you really need to answer what they're actually getting to. And so that's that critical thinking, that clinical decision making. I completely agree of just getting used to that format. We don't have to like the format, but that is the format that they use. And so I definitely agree, just preparing your brain to think that way so that you can kind of get to the heart of the question. It's so important. And I love the YouTube. I'm old enough to know that we didn't have that as a resource. I mean, it existed maybe back then, but it wasn't full of all of the videos, especially the ones, as you mentioned, geared towards helping people learn and study. So a really great resource that, people should consider. Talk to me about review courses. Did you take a review course? Was it in person, an online course? And, do you have any thoughts on what pros and cons of each of those are?
Like I mentioned, I did do the online course with UWorld, but I went to the University of Pittsburgh and they hosted a week-long in-person review course for us too, which was so helpful. The in-person review course is great because it really holds you accountable. You are there for a week to study and to go over with professors any topics that you have difficulties with. But that being said, a con of that is you are taking this class with a bunch of other people. So if other people have topics that you already are well versed on, but they aren't, you're going over things that you already know. So it's a lot less personalized than an online course where you can focus specifically on yourself would be. But in person is always great. I feel like for me personally, and probably a lot of other people, you learn a lot better when someone is there teaching you and like helping you through something rather than trying to do all the work yourself.
I think you brought up some great points of, somebody can actually give more details or maybe explain it in a different way. If the first way that it was presented, you need a clarification. So having that live person there can actually help give you more depth. But as you also mentioned, sometimes they're going to go in depth on things that you don't need, that you already understand well. But I would say maybe the flip side is that people might raise questions that you didn't think of or hadn't brought up before. And so I agree. It adds definitely some variability, the live in-person training and review. But yeah, what I would say is that it's great that we have both options because certainly there's pros and cons to both. We talked a little bit about this already, but how important were practice questions in your exam preparation?
Practice questions are everything. You mentioned already that the NCLEX questions are formulated in a very specific way. And I know some schools do all their exams in NCLEX style, but some schools don't. So some people might not know how the NCLEX formulates their questions. A lot of the time it's you have to pick the most correct out of a lot of correct answers. And if you don't have practice critically thinking about how to answer these questions, you might get tripped up. So practicing these questions, knowing what the test will be like is so important. And even more than just like practice questions, I feel like practice exams are also really important because you can take as many questions as you want, but to pass the NCLEX, you have to be able to sit down and answer 85 to 150 questions in a row. I know for me, at least, I could do 10 practice questions, but then my mind is wandering other places. So it's really important to do your practice questions, but also be able to do a bunch of practice questions at a time.
Absolutely. That staying focused, kind of staying in it for as long as it's going to take to get through the actual exam. That's certainly important. And the rationale, learning the questions format, getting comfortable to kind of pick through the noise and find what really is being asked. But also then, whether you get it right or wrong, if there's rationale to understand what the right answer is, that can either reinforce what you already knew or, of course, teach you the right answer. And so lots of benefits to doing the practice questions. I know that there's books out there. There's websites now of just nothing but quiz questions to getting you kind of in that groove. So a great resource there. Obviously, it's a big test and it has a lot of pressure hanging on it. But you've got life outside of studying for this exam too. So how did you balance the rigor of studying for the NCLEX with the other responsibilities that you have?
It was definitely a challenge. I was lucky enough that I finished school before I had to take the exam. And then I gave myself time to study for the exam. But not everyone has that ability. And even though I gave myself this time, I still had to work while I was studying. Really, time management is the best thing that you can do. When I was working, still had goals for myself for studying, even if it was just study this topic today or do 10 practice questions today. Anything that you're doing is better than nothing. So if you have to color code your life and in Google Calendar have 2 hours to work, 2 hours to study, or, eat lunch from 12 to 1 and then from 1 to 2, you study. Anything that you have to do to make sure that you get at least a little bit of studying in matters.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, there's so many more tools now that can help you study. Some of those are portable, whether it's on the go, whether it's an app that you can do, maybe if you're taking the train or you're commuting somehow. We've heard from our listeners that if they're preparing for certification, for oncology certification, listening to these podcasts can sometimes help reinforce concepts that they want to make sure that they really understand. And so finding those creative ways to fit time to study into your already very busy life, that's a great recommendation. Along that same line, how did you find time to take care of yourself while working and studying for the exam and making sure that you're not burning yourself out before you've even started?
This is a personal thing, but I like to use a reward system for myself. So I'll tell myself, if I do this number of questions or study these topics, write down these notes, then I can get a 10-minute break, or I can go eat a cookie or a snack. And I feel like hyping myself up to know that there is an end to all this studying is what really helped me. And even more than that, you can't study for the entire day. Your brain can't handle all that information. So just telling yourself it's okay to take a break. It's better for myself if I give myself time to go see my friends, to go take a walk, to, go eat a snack. That stuff matters too.
I love that. And that's so important. You're absolutely right. The brain can only handle so much. Any more than that, it's probably wasted effort because you won't retain it. If you're not in the right sort of headspace and sort of mindset to take it all in, then it's probably best that you wait until you are. So I love how you incorporated those important, not even distractions, but just important parts of life in the midst of trying to study for this very important exam. And that leads us to the exam itself. A lot of people have test anxiety. It's a real thing. And even if you don't suffer from it all the time, knowing that this test is so important and really kind of is going to make all of the effort that you did through nursing school have meaning. You have to get that license. So how did you deal with the nerves, both before and maybe even during taking the exam?
Before taking the exam, this is going to sound so cheesy, but deep breathing is so important. It works so well. I personally use the square method for breathing, and it helped so much. Just being able to focus on your breath, take time inwards to breathe. It will give yourself a break. It will give your mind a break. It is so worth it. And then I would say trust yourself. You did all this studying. You know all this information. You will get through the test. The test is not even a single day of your life. And it matters, but there are other opportunities. You can take the test again. It's not a be all, done all. It's okay.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned sort of breathing exercises and things that just kind of helped you kind of calm yourself, center yourself a little bit. We do have a nurse wellbeing learning library on ONS.org that has lots of resources about, wellness in general, but we do also have some tools that you can use to help either visualize calming sort of landscapes or practice some of these breathing techniques, because you're absolutely right. Like these can help, I agree. Like some people might feel a little silly doing them, but they work. They really do work. And so we really encourage our listeners to check those resources out and consider if they can incorporate those in, whether it's their studying, their test taking, or even just the stressful day to day. Some of these tools can really be beneficial. So let's put ourselves in your shoes. You were there. It was the night before your exam. What did you do to help prepare that night before, that morning of, to really put yourself in the best mindset to take that exam?
Everyone will probably say this, but it is so true. Do not cram the night before the exam. The most important thing the night before the exam is to get a good night's sleep. You might be so nervous. You're like, I can get any new information that matters right before the exam, but you can't. Any information that you will have gotten in those time that you spend studying already. Really, you have to trust yourself. You put all this time into studying. You know all this information. You did the practice questions. You did the practice exams. You study the topics. You are ready to take the exam.
Absolutely. So well said. And it just emphasizes, as you've already reinforced, just the importance of giving yourself a well-paced, comprehensive plan to study, giving yourself the time that you might need to feel confident that you'll never learn it all. And the test isn't about knowing everything. And so, you can only do your best and study the parts that you maybe feel like you need a stronger kind of handle on. But You can only do so much, but if you have given yourself that time and really been sort of intentional and methodical about how you want to study, then you will arrive to that test feeling like you did what you could. And you're right. Either you know it or you don't. By the day of, nothing you learned the night before is going to stick with you. So focus on those self-care practices of good sleep, good nutrition, waking up refreshed and as ready as you can be. So when the test came, it's all usually in one of those proctored rooms and like lots of different rules and regulations. And that certainly doesn't make you feel super relaxed. But how did you manage your time during the exam itself? That's certainly that timed pressure doesn't help people feel relaxed. But what did you do to help manage the time? And do you have any tips for pacing yourself during these types of exams?
I just want to reiterate how important deep breathing is. Take a breath, reread the question, and recenter yourself to be in a mind space to be able to take that test. You've been taking practice questions. You know how long it takes you to answer a question. Some of these questions you already know the answer to. Some questions will take longer, and that's okay. When you have to think critically, pick the best choice. But some questions on the NCLEX are knowledge-based. So you will know the answer right away. Give yourself that time. You might think, I spent so long on one question, but you didn't spend so long on a different question. You're balancing yourself out. You have a long time to take the NCLEX. You have 5 hours to take the test. Even if you went all the way to the end of the test, it's 2 minutes a question. And that might not seem like a lot of time, but as it's going, it feels like a lot of time. It's very hard to run out of time, I would say.
And so maybe a final question is, looking back, you prepared, you were successful in passing. When you look back at what you did to prepare, is there anything that you would do differently? Or if not, is there anything that you feel like was really a key to your success?
We already touched on this, but questions. I cannot reiterate enough how important practice questions are. And I know you mentioned this too, not even making sure you get them correct, but learning from the questions that you answered incorrectly. Understanding why you answered it incorrectly, either because you didn't know the answer or because you didn't understand how to answer the question. The NCLEX is tricky. I don't want to say it's trying to trick you, but some of the questions they want you to pick the most correct answer. And that's hard sometimes out of 4 correct answers. One thing that I wish I had done differently is not taking enough time for myself. I was holed up in my room, staring at my laptop, studying for hours at a time. It would have been so beneficial for me to even just close my laptop for 5 minutes and shut my eyes, just to get rid of the blue light headache and really be able to focus on the questions instead of just trying to answer as many questions as I could.
Well, those are great tips. Everything you've shared today with us, Talia, has been really, really helpful. And I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think applies not only to any nursing students out there that are finishing their degree and preparing for taking the NCLEX, or for our experienced nurses who are gearing up for that first attempt at taking their certification exam. I think all of the information and the tips and tricks you've shared apply to both of those populations of nurses. And so I really appreciate you joining us today on the podcast. As we reach the end of our episode, we'd like to always ask a few wrap-up questions just to help summarize some of the things that we've talked about today. So to start that off, what are some of the common misconceptions that you think nurses have about preparing for a large exam like a NCLEX or a certification exam?
I feel like you don't have to be studying 24/7. You have a life outside of the exam, and you should still live it. You should still see your friends, and you should still go out to eat. Do things that make you feel good. Because if you are not in your best headspace, you won't be able to study appropriately.
What's something about this topic of studying and preparing for exams that's not often discussed, but you wish people knew or talked more about?
Something that I wish was discussed more often is just all the resources that are out there. There's a lot of paid resources, but there's also a lot of free resources. I know personally, my school gave out textbooks, and those have questions in them too. There's always ways to find resources that would be beneficial for you. Quizlet has lots of, obviously, questions on there, and people make open for VIEW, NCLEX resource questions. Those are fully ready to be answered.
Absolutely. And I often see, nurses that finally, they do it, they get it, they pass that NCLEX. If they did buy any resources, whether it's books or review materials, they usually are very willing to pass those on to people who haven't done that yet or who need those. And so searching for those opportunities. And as you mentioned, just being open to exploring new or unique ways to consume some of these study materials. Lots of websites, lots of these quizzing kind of development websites, YouTube, as you mentioned, just lots of things that are out there now that aren't just your standard textbook multiple choice questions. So I really appreciate you bringing those to light and sharing those recommendations with our listeners today. Thank you again for joining us today, Talia. Congratulations, and excited for you to be kicking off your nursing career. I'm sure you have years and years ahead of you, and maybe someday we'll bring you over to the oncology side away from the NICU if we can convince you to come over. So do you have any final comments to share with our listeners today?
I really just want to say to anyone who is going to be taking the NCLEX or any other certification exam, you got this. Obviously, someone who's listening to a podcast right now about preparing for an exam is on the right track towards studying and passing an exam. You got this. I'm wishing you all the luck out there.
I agree. You've got it. Thanks so much. Thank you for listening to the ONS Podcast. Tell us about your favorite part in this episode by leaving a review wherever you download your podcast. For more resources and information about oncology nursing, visit us at ons.org and ons.org/voice. The ideas and opinions shared in this episode represent those of the guest and not necessarily ONS.